responsive to those needs. But if we're going to see more of those co-ops, if we're going to do more for the cooperative sector, we got to take a much broader approach, and we need to be much more broadly active. We need to consider the sector in which it's operating. What is the capacity of that sector? What is their ability to support education around co-ops, to provide technical services to create new co-ops and promote co-op development? What is the capital market that co-ops can access? What's our role within that capital market? And then what is the enabling environment for co-ops? What is the legislation? What does policy look like? And so there's a role for us to play across all of these bands. I wouldn't call this holistic. I mean, there's more in heaven and earth that can be covered by this approach, but it's a broad spectrum, and we need to try and be active in all of it. But speaking specifically around capital markets, in our sector, we've got some challenges around this model. And I think there's a number of causes for that. One, it's the model itself. I mean, we know co-ops can't go to the stock market, right? Co-ops are constrained by the way they can access capital. And we take that for a given. But there's other problems here. I think there's lots of capital around. It's just that co-ops seem to have a hard time accessing it. So certainly venture capitalists don't like this kind of model, right? If you're working in the service of your membership and you are compromising or mitigating profit maximization because you need to better serve that membership, that's generally speaking not a model that a lot of venture capitalists like, right? I mean, there's not much of an opportunity for extraction there. But there's other pockets of capital that should be available to co-ops that are not. So I'm thinking in particular, and I'll try not to name names, but there's an organization in British Columbia that provides capital for young entrepreneurs, people under 30, and they don't fund co-ops. Why? Well, I never get a good answer. They're a non-governmental organization funded by Industry Canada, which is the home of the Cooperative Secretariat for our country. So, okay, we have a problem. Provincial government in British Columbia has a pool of money that is allocated to the public based on gambling revenues, which unfortunately we're gaining too much of. Not-for-profit co-ops, what we refer to as community service co-ops, were excluded from that pool of capital. Why? Again, no good answer. Personally, I think this is a relatively exotic model. We don't have nearly as many co-ops as we should have, and so they don't turn up as often as other forms of business would. And so the funders look at this beast, and it's far easier for somebody to say no rather than yes, and incur the activation costs of trying to learn how to support this kind of model, right? Then, okay, so maybe co-ops can't go to source A, they can't go to source B, they can't go to venture capitalists, let's go to our credit unions. Okay, we got another problem there, is that most credit unions have a really hard time lending to co-ops. The sad irony that co-ops can't support co-ops, can't finance co-ops. That's not universally true. There are some small credit unions in British Columbia that are doing a fantastic job with that. And it's something that we're trying to do much, much more of in Van City. And to be honest, it's a relatively new thing for us. I think we probably had some greater capacity in the past, and now we're relearning how to do this thing. We're relearning how to assess risk for a cooperative and how to be able to put on our filter when necessary. So what does that look like? Well, I think it's a creation of specific tools around this model. Because as we know, working in this sector, right, when you've met one co-op, you've met one co-op, right? They're all different, they're idiosyncratic, they're tailor-made to serve the needs of their members. And so the capital structure for each co-op can be different. So part of that, what that means is that we have to come up with specific tools to address specific categories of co-op at the very least. So if you want to buy into an equity housing co-op, you can come to Van City, you can get a mortgage. We're the only credit union in the province that will do that. we've invested in the paperwork, and we share that with other credit unions, and they're happy to take it, and then I think get really confused and don't want to incur the activation costs, and so they come to us. If you want to join a workers' cooperative and you can't afford the membership share, which is maybe $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000, we can do a microloan, and we can get that capital into the hands of the co-op, rather than the co-op having to go through wage deductions, deferred dividends, and all these sorts of things, and creates this tension within the co-op. And then the co-op comes to us looking for financing. Well, my first question is, are all your members paid up? If they're not, well, there's your capital right there, right? Let's make the model work for itself, right? We have a microfinance division, and that is often the first point. We usually direct some of our startup co-ops through microfinance. We can go $50,000 on that. It's relatively easy terms. It's lending based on character rather than collateral. And so that's a great opportunity for co-ops to get that startup. Then we have a gap, and then we have conventional lending. And hopefully co-ops, we can try and get co-ops into conventional lending at some point in the future. But there's a gap there. And it doesn't just affect co-ops, it affects a variety of business. You've gone through microfinance, you've gotten some capital, and then what do you do? So right now, we're just put the ink's not even dry on this thing. We've created within the boundaries of our organization a co-op capital fund. Just as a pilot, just to sort of try this out, with the idea being that if we build it, they will come, right? It's, as Christine said, capital that is non-extractive, that is attuned specifically to this kind of organizational structure. We're putting the rules on it now. They're very broad. Interest is 2%, simple interest, non-compounded. This is pretty attractive for co-ops. The impetus to do this was a paper written by Tom Webb at the Sobey School of Business that talked about the need to create a capital product that is, again, attuned to co-ops. So again, familiar with these things. So we can use it as collateral for conventional financing. We could use it as something that looks more like equity than debt. So we can, or possibly a GROAN, repayable grant, or a grant loan. So one balloon payment at the end of the term, and if that leaves the co-op in some needing additional finance, that way we can turn it into a debt instrument. So at least get over the hump the first 3 years, which seems to be for co-ops something that requires a lot of some effort. As I said, the ink's not even dry on this thing, and my phone's already ringing. I've got my colleagues saying I've got a co-op, it'll be perfect, and so yes, it's working. I don't think we'll have any problem rolling this out. It's a very modest fund. It's just $250,000, but it's just something that we can sort of take for a test drive and see what happens. One last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of the capital markets piece and that enabling environment is that, I mean, this is all good work. And it takes up a good amount of our time to to free up and create all these new instruments. But it's that enabling environment piece where I think there's a real opportunity to unleash some kind of capital. The Cooperative Associations Act, the act governing cooperative creation, cooperatives in British Columbia, allows for external investor shares, non-voting members. I think here you would refer to them as preferred shares in a co-op, right? And it was an innovation when it was introduced some 10 years ago into the Act. Everybody celebrated it. And whenever a co-op comes to us and says, well, we'd like to consider investment shares, we tell them, you really shouldn't do that. The cost associated with creating an investment share is prohibitively high, somewhere around $12,000, $13,000 to get all the legal work done. That's if the share is below $5,000. If you go at $5,001, you trigger securities regulations, and boom, now you're entering a world of pain, right? And so we tell people it's just not worth it. I mean, because how can if you're looking, especially if you're looking for a substantive amount of capital, and you need to go out wide and get a large group of people at $5,000 a piece, you're not going to raise a lot of money. So, and this is and it's arbitrarily constrained. I mean, in British Columbia, you can go down to one of our local casinos and you can blow your life savings in an afternoon, and nobody's going to bat an eye. But if you invest $5,001 in a cooperative, then you're some kind of degenerate, right? You know, so it's a problem. So working together within the sector, we have a new government in British Columbia, hopefully one, and we think one that is much more sensitive to these kinds of business models, to advocate, and this is an important part of the work that we do, for change to that act, and to free up those arbitrary restrictions on the amount of capital that the public can invest in local economic entities that are doing a social and economic benefit to their communities. Sure. Yeah, everybody gets this wrong. Elvezio del Bianco. And I'm with Van City. We are a financial service cooperative with 523,000 members, 2,500 employees, and some $20 billion in funds under administration, if I'm not mistaken, looking at my colleagues. Yes. Okay, great. I look forward to your questions in the discussion. Thanks very much.
Do they really call it a groan?
Yes.
Like, okay.
Unofficially.
Unofficially. Not in any of your documents.
No.
Gotcha. All right. Next we have Derek Razo. So we've heard from a couple of a CDFI, that's also a cooperative, and a credit union. But now we're going to look at more of the equity investment side, and have Derek talk to you about Purpose, which came together recently, pretty recently, with a different model of a fund, with a different model for investment that is different from traditional investment. He can tell you a little bit more about how that structure works.
Awesome. Thank you, Camille. Can you all hear me? Is this good? Okay, great. Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm here today to talk to you about aligning impact, ownership, and finance, and to sort of talk through some practical lessons that we've learned at Purpose Capital, the organization that I'm here representing, in funding the platform co-op movement. So very practical kind of like overview of what we're doing, and then some lessons from that. Yeah, I guess first I'm curious to ask how many people in the audience would identify as entrepreneurs who are looking for capital? All right. How many people are working with financial institutions or are in the role of investors or analysts? Okay, nice. Good contingent of both. Okay, so this talk will kind of be aimed at both, but we'll skew slightly more towards entrepreneurs given that there's such a high density in this room. So I kind of want to start by talking a little bit about my journey towards platform cooperativism and the work that we're doing now. I'm an entrepreneur and a developer. My background is in some combination of technical sciences and economics. And I guess the way that I came to this was between the years 2014 and 2016, I went on this sort of self-funded research trip around the world to try to figure out what is the new economy, who's doing it, who's doing the most impactful projects, and what do they need? How can we support them? This sounds really linear when I put it on a slide, but I didn't exactly know that that's what I was doing at the time. So as I traveled around, Central America, all over Europe, North America, and more. I spent a long time in New Zealand working with the Inspiral Network on Lumio and a couple other projects that have been mentioned throughout this conference. I noticed this really interesting problem, which I think we're speaking to today, which is that ownership is not okay to innovate on in the finance sector. Ownership is for some reason this weird zone that we're supposed to ignore. And on the other side of that, social companies that ignore ownership as a central concern for how to achieve their social mission, in the long term, regret it. We've seen this. I think there's more than enough stories of people who go and take VC funding. They have a really strong social mission, but after a long time, it becomes clear that the social mission and the financing structures and the incentives just don't line up, and they have to make some serious compromises. So I noticed this in every country that I went to, which was really striking. And I met people who were trying to work on this, and I had this sort of transformational experience of realizing that we don't have to be consumers of our economy. We can be designers of our economy. So I kind of want to frame my talk and the work that we're doing in this context of what is, maybe a more specific question. If you could start over as a society deciding what a company is for and how it's going to work, how would you do it? I just want to sort of leave that in the air as we go through. So a little bit about purpose. Our mission is to help companies stay independent and mission-driven for the long term. And we do this by promoting what we call steward ownership. Steward ownership is related to cooperative ownership. It's a sort of superset of cooperative ownership, meaning it's inclusive of cooperatives but not exclusive to cooperatives. And steward ownership is defined really by two principles. We didn't invent these principles. We looked all around the world at who's doing the most powerful, impactful, long-term ownership innovation, and we kind of extracted some core principles from that. So we've got this nice little animation, or this nice little drawing, but the two principles that we think of as defining steward ownership, and these will be very familiar to you. So profits are not a means to an end, is the first one. This means that all profits need to eventually go towards serving the mission of the company and not towards accumulating with some central authority or finance figure. This means that beyond repayment to investors and repayment to founders, which we like to see capped, all profits of a company are either reinvested in the company, in the mission, profit sharing, whatever, or donated back to civil society. So the company becomes an engine for social progress rather than an engine for extraction. The second principle is entrepreneurship equals ownership. And this one is a little bit more subtle in its expression, but really concrete in how we actually implement it. What this means is that we want to see companies that are independent of external shareholders that control the company and that can steer the company. So the idea here is that we want to separate the steering wheel of the company from the financial incentives that the company is beholden to. So we do this in a number of ways, but one easy way to think of it is at least 51% of the company needs to be a non-tradable good. These are no-exit companies. They're not going to sell out. They're going to make a structural promise to stay independent for the long term. This model has over 100-year history worldwide, especially in Europe, and many of them are cooperatives. So I just want to lay this as a complementary structure and another way of thinking about your own ownership journey as entrepreneurs, and another sort of subsector and set of things to think about for us as financiers. Great. Sorry, everything needs refreshing. Cool, so a couple examples of steward-owned companies that you might know of. Bosch is the world famous tool maker, electronics, automobile components. If you've ridden in a car in the last 50 years, then you've used a lot of, your life has depended on Bosch products. They're a foundation-owned company, and they've been foundation-owned for over 60 years. John Lewis Partnership, which is a very famous cooperative, kind of at the level of Mondragon in some ways. They're a cooperative trust. They do department stores, groceries, financial services, kind of anything that you can think of. By the time you're at that scale, they sort of have to do a lot of different things, especially for their members. And the last one that I want to talk about, just because it's a really nice story, is Zeiss. Zeiss is a medical device manufacturer. And again, if you've gone to a doctor's office and used any machinery whatsoever in the last 50, really to 100 years, you have used Zeiss products, and your life has depended on Zeiss products. Zeiss is a foundation-owned company, And over the last 10 years alone, they've donated over $100 million, especially in the areas where their headquarters are based, to help build schools, give scholarships to exceptional academics, and do research in the field of public health and medicine. So these companies are doing really significant social good work. It's not tokenistic donations. These are large sums that are creating positive impact. So how do we actually do this? How do we fund these companies? Is the question sort of the panel, right? And what do we do as purpose? So we kind of have three main areas of activity. We fund steward-owned companies, or companies that are making a commitment to transitioning to steward ownership. We support transition and succession for founders who want to either grow a company and need growth capital, or want to succeed. And I'll talk about the use cases in just a minute. But that's cultural, legal, financial support. And we also do research on alternative ownership and finance, and are trying to create an empirical basis of evidence on top of already the cooperative base of evidence that these companies are really positive for society, really positive for long-term profit, and really, really transformational for the ability to pursue mission in the long term. And our initial research shows exactly these things, and I can share the details with you maybe in the talk. Cool. So our investment areas are three. We do growth capital for companies. You might think of it like VC, alternative VC. And in that area, we do a lot of work to align other investors, do investor education, and help set up the deal. So it's a very collaborative process with the entrepreneurs. We do ownership conversions, where we provide liquidity for early investors and founders so that they're able to convert their companies to autonomous, independent, steward-owned companies or cooperatives without having to sacrifice making some money, because being an entrepreneur is really, really hard. Most of you know that. So often we'll buy back or restructure shares. And succession planning. This is sort of bigger, and we're only just getting started with doing some succession planning work. But that often includes creating some kind of pension for the founders, maybe ESOP plans, and a lot of legal and cultural support to transition a company from one ownership and management model to another. So in terms of our investment process, really similarly to what has been said already, we sort of think of ourselves as cobblers, not Cinderella seekers. I don't know exactly how to frame this metaphor, but it's like, rather than trying to find the perfect company and fit our standardized shoe on them that we've made, we kind of build the shoe with the company in order to make sure that the capital instrument is going to serve the purpose in the long term. Nathan sort of asked me to walk through what a deal would look like, so I sort of wrote up these points. It's not quite this linear. They often happen kind of simultaneously, but we meet founders. We sort of make an initial analysis. Does this company have a good chance in the market? Does this company have a really good founding team? Does this company have, there's a list that I'm very happy to share with you. All of our documentation is open source. And then we sort of co-design both the investment structure and the future ownership structure with the company. So we try to help the founders and the workers think through, well, what do you really want to get out of steward ownership? For some of them, they want cooperative ownership, and they want democratic control. For some of them, they actually want something a little bit, something in the middle between totally hierarchical, fully centralized control and totally democratic. And so we help them navigate that spectrum. And then the last step is support and engage. We're trying to build a community of companies, founders, who are working together on this mission of building their companies in a way that builds a better society. These are some instruments that we use, both financial tools and corporate structures. Some of these things have already been named, but some common tools that we work with entrepreneurs to do investment are performance-based loans. So that means you might get a loan and it will scale over time depending on how well you do. So we do better if you do better, but you're not required necessarily to return 10x. But if you do really, really well, maybe you can return 10x and the company can still keep its mission and we don't have to take voting shares. So it kind of creates this flexibility on both sides. Demand dividends are a newer structure that we're experimenting with, where you have a holiday period, and then you have a repayment schedule that is based on free cash flow, which has some sort of formula associated with it. We can go more into the details of these. Preferred share in the discussion. Preferred shares, non-voting equity. The thing that all of these have in common is that they don't compromise the decision-making of the leadership of the company by separating, or by us as financiers taking control, even in a small way. And so we try to bring other investors along with us on this journey. All right. This is in some ways like the meat of the presentation, right? Lessons learned. So we've been doing this for about a year, maybe more. Specifically the fund, we've been supporting companies for about 3 years to do transitions and do cultural work, but the fund is relatively new. And the most common thing that I hear from entrepreneurs that I talk to is, oh my God, I never knew that this is what I wanted, but this is what I want. For some reason, many of these entrepreneurs know about co-ops, but have not sought a cooperative ownership solution. So this is in some ways a door opener for a lot of more traditionally minded entrepreneurs who have social motivation and who are also sort of analytical and think critically about the world, but don't know exactly how to implement their ideas. Another lesson is that when we're doing things differently, support is absolutely key. Co-designing these investments with the investees is central to how we're actually able to make these deals work. And that support goes all the way to investor relationships, helping convert existing investors onto newer and more friendly terms, stuff like that. So this is really, really key. Another really important piece that we've noticed is that having a lead investor who's going to invest on cooperative or steward-owned terms changes the entire game. Because what it means is you now have somebody saying, we're validating your structure, we're validating this weird, maybe alternative financial model that you want to use. If your business is really a good business and looks like it's going to have success, investors will come with you. That's what we've been learning. And to that point, I think, because we're in a room full of entrepreneurs, this point is especially salient. Platform co-ops still need sustainable competitive advantage. It is not sufficient to say, we're going to do this thing like this group, only we're going to do it as a cooperative, because just being cooperative does not make you more fit to compete in the marketplace necessarily. But we do really look for companies that try to use their ownership structure, specifically steward ownership in our case, as a competitive advantage. So some things that drive our decision-making, obviously I'll close it up. We don't control the companies that we invest in, so there's an emphasis on trust and commitment to the long term. We try to invest in people, not necessarily just ideas. We customize our investments, and we want to influence and change the norms of investment, not just in the traditional investment world, but also in the impact investing scene and in the VC world. So I guess the downbeat of my presentation here is I am super excited to co-create with all of you a new story for how entrepreneurship works in a social economy. It's a story where entrepreneurs are rewarded for taking risk. Employees have exceptional rights, governance rights, often exactly the same as a co-op or something similar. Better wages, better stake, longer employment, more stable employment. Investors are able to make decent returns that they can build funds on top of, because you need a certain type of return to build a fund. And for society, we get this decentralized economy where it's not a couple big companies buying everything. It's companies with similar missions working together. And that's the story that I want to tell, and I hope that you will help us tell it, and I hope that we can help you tell it. So that's us. Thank you. Oh, whoops.
Thanks so much. So next we're going to hear from Aaron Tanaka, and he's an organizer and an investor and a thought leader in the worker ownership space, currently executive director of the Center for Economic Democracy, and you're still affiliated with BII? And what's your role there now?
Investment committee and board.
Investment in committee and board for the Boston Impact Initiative as well. So thanks so much for being here.
There you go.
Thank you. All right, thank you. My name is Aaron Tanaka again. I was gonna try to load up a video actually, but I didn't do it beforehand. So, what? What? Oh, the thing's not on at all?
I'll try to figure that out.
Okay, or not even video, just the PowerPoint would be good at this point.
Just try this. Unplug methods. Thank you.
All right, awesome, thank you. Okay, so just gonna, do we get sound here? Oh shit. Okay, never mind. All right, thank you for your patience. I'm really happy to be here. I've been looking forward to being here because I definitely am not a technologist per se, although I'm enthusiastic about computers and stuff. I don't really identify myself as sort of like someone who's a leader in the platform co-op space, but when it comes to the question on democratization of finance and capital, that's been a lot of the work that I've been doing. So just really quickly about myself, I come out of a background as an organizer. I was the director of a group called the Boston Workers Alliance for 8 years. And we organize folks who are under and unemployed, people coming out of prison who can find work. And a lot of our work was around traditional base building, community organizing, passing Ban the Box in Massachusetts, amongst other major policies. But as we were doing that, started to ask the question, instead of begging people to hire our members because they have criminal records and trying to prove that they're going to be great employees, why don't we actually build our own institutions, our own businesses? And so we actually started getting into co-op development, and in particular, worker-owned co-op development led by folks who are formerly incarcerated and people who had barriers to employment. And out of that process, I started to realize how difficult it was to build a business as a whole, how little the nonprofit sector knew about entrepreneurship, and how little we knew about finance and capital. And so from there, I kind of had two trajectories. One was actually getting to run the city of Boston's first participatory budgeting project, which was a campaign that we were pushing when I was at the Workers Alliance, but then also had the opportunity to help start the Boston Impact Initiative as its first managing director, which was a place-based private impact investment fund, a small $5 million pilot fund that was doing debt, private equity, convertible notes, and small grant making. So I kind of had the opportunity to be on the side of the entrepreneur, trying to really do economic development rooted in racial equity and justice, and then at the same time having opportunity to play with finance tools and strategies that I think were mostly out of the box. I had some finance background, but in a lot of ways my learning was through the actual investment process. And so I think I might be repeating things or just sort of stating the obvious in terms of frameworks within the platform co-op context, but for me, this opportunity, which I really want to thank you for, Camille and other folks, has given me the opportunity to sort of think and ask, how do those lessons and learnings and theory apply to this particular space? And so that's what I wanted to talk about. So I was going to show this video about the Boston Ujima project, but instead I'm just going to describe it really briefly. The reason I wanted to talk about this was because it's both an investment platform, but also needs a bunch of platforms for the ecosystem. And so it's sort of like a call for help if you are interested in helping us think about the tools, but also I want to highlight Ujima project as a model of democratically governed finance that may be relevant as a way to invest into platform co-ops, but also the way to think about the democratization of finance in general. And I appreciate your point, Christina, at the very beginning about the sort of dilution of the term democratization of finance, whether it's the empowerment of capital simply, or it simply means that we have crowdfunding and allow for people who aren't rich to be part of the finance sector, right? Neither of those to me represent the democratization of capital. And I should actually just take one step back. A lot of the purpose of the Center for Economic Democracy is actually to build long-term social movements that build alternatives to capitalism. And so that's the premise from which I'm moving. And really, really briefly, we're not interested in sort of replicating top-down state socialism, but in our alternative, we're interested in raising up the democratic allocation and the process of democratic planning to allocate land, labor, and resources and capital in our communities through a democratic process. And so that's a lot of the theory that underlines the purpose of the Ujima project. So really quickly, we are building a multi-stakeholder ecosystem. We've been planning for 3 years, launched officially just 3 months ago with about 230 members. And we have all these sort of folks in the middle, rooted in grassroots-based building organizations, small businesses and co-ops. We have investors and funders. We have, who else? We have people, regular folks, families, And then we also work with major institutional anchors like hospitals and universities, which folks who know about the evergreen co-op model, we sort of use a lot of those strategies. So really quickly, we're building this democratically governed investment fund. And what that means is that it's a multi-tranche fund. At the base, there's a community capital pool that allows for non-accredited investors, people who can invest $50 and up into a fund. And we haven't launched a fund officially yet, so I should also say that. But we have this sort of product that allows for regular folks to invest. Then we're also going to have institutional capital from impact investors like the Boston Impact Initiative and other foundations, for example. And then we're going to have sort of a loss reserve, program-related investments and grant dollars that'll help secure, what I mean by that is to protect the small investors so that if the fund goes south, at least there's some cushion to protect everyday people from losing their savings, right? And so we're building this sort of multi-stakeholder capital stack. But the most important thing, and what we mean when we say the democratization of finance, is that whether you put in $50 or you put in $50,000, everyone has an equal vote in the allocation and the priorities of the capital fund itself. So what we mean by that is we're taking the model of participatory budgeting, which is typically used in the allocation of tax dollars, which is happening here in New York and Boston, all over the country, started in Porto Alegre in Brazil. The idea that everyone has actually a say and actually has knowledge and expertise that is valuable and useful. Not only is it a moral thing, but it's actually can help us make better decisions. So in our case, we're saying we want to bring capital to working class communities of color in Boston. Who better than the people who live there, who are rooted here, who care about the community, to help us understand what the market opportunities, the business needs, and the investment opportunities could be in our own community. So we are actually taking this idea to say, hey, actually, we're actually building this internally built market feasibility process that actually most entrepreneurs would die for, to actually say, is there a market? Are people going to support this thing? So that is sort of the premise of the democratization of the capital fund. And we sort of have this entire ecosystem then to support the success of our portfolio. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this because this is just an example of how we think about democratization of capital. But we want to build these neighborhood assemblies that help build neighborhood plans. We have a good business alliance at the top that sort of replicates like a fair trade or like a B Corp standard. We're building our own standards around what does it mean to be a good business. If you want to get capital from us, you have to meet these standards. We're organizing from the middle, if you see that green line up, consumer spending to say, hey, we all voted on a grocery store and we have our money in this grocery store. We hope you go shop at this grocery store, right? And we actually are looking at different platforms that might incentivize and organize people to spend their consumer capital towards that direction. And then we have these anchor institutions on the right there, hospitals, universities, government that purchase billions of dollars in Boston every year. Very little of it is going to small businesses or entrepreneurs. Most of it's going out of state or to big multinationals. How do we actually use political pressure of our collective community to get these folks to purchase from these same businesses? And then finally, we work with students in the divestments, fossil fuel and prison divestment campaigns on university campuses, and actually helping them build a demand for the reinvestment of divested capital into community funds. So it's one thing to take your money out of Exxon, but then it just goes back into Walmart. It's not super helpful from our perspective on how do you build a just transition from this extractive economy to the future that we're trying to build, right? So that's sort of the whole ecosystem, and obviously could talk much, much more about this, but I wanted to point this out because of the nature of the democratic capital, but then also to say we ourselves are trying to build platforms or looking for platforms that help us do a lot of this stuff. So for example, with our voting stuff, we're using Votes, which is a new blockchain-based sort of voting app. They are trying to position themselves to be the actual tool that you use for absentee voting in actual government elections, for example. Investment platform Venture 360, not at all a cooperative platform or a community people's platform. It's a VC platform, but this is what we have to use. It allows for investors to see how the investments are doing, allows for the businesses to put their applications into the system. And so I would love for someone to create a better, less extractive version of this kind of company, for example. We already have these sort of community standard stuff around B Corp. There's something called Switch that gives you a score for businesses you're shopping at and then tells you, hey, you should go shop somewhere else. They have a higher social impact. Main Street Markets and Credibles are types of alternative community currencies. Main Street Markets is trying to move towards more of a blockchain application working with Bianco. And then we have product alignment, Provenance, done good. Like Provenance is also a blockchain-based app that tells you sort of the history of the product, like what's the social inputs, are these good businesses, was there child labor involved in it? It kind of gives you the history of all the inputs into this stuff. Okay, so anyway, these are some of the platforms that we're actually hoping maybe someone here is already building or would help us integrate. So coming to the conversation of capital then, like we talked about the broad democratization of capital, but I did want to sort of share just this question about community capital solutions because many of you are probably looking for capital. I do want to raise up this point that I think was made by some people yesterday. In Boston, for example, the racial wealth disparities are so severe. So in the Black community, average family owns about $7 as opposed to the average white family's net assets are about $250,000, right? And so when it comes to this question about friends and family financing, there is a reality that the racial disparities, the social circles we have, deeply, deeply limit the kinds of community capital that we could raise. And in our belief with Ujima is that if we could get to scale and to get enough people in a community to put in, there is a level of volume that we could reach. And so I just wanted to quickly point out, kind of just shout out these different capital tools. I'm really not a sort of community capital expert. Camille probably knows more about this stuff than I do, but there's folks like Michael Schumann or Amy Cortez, all these cutting edge capital, Jenny Kassan, who do this work in general, and really I'm learning from these folks. But I just want to kind of point out, there's a whole bunch of ways that you could raise capital from non-accredited investors and different kinds of capital, be it grant, debt, equity, revenue-based lending. And with the Jobs Act, there's tons of other sort of products sort of coming online. Okay. I do also want to note that in terms of who gets access to this community capital, folks at Investible have done sort of initial analysis and have found that actually, a larger percentage of women and people of color and local businesses are getting funding through the community crowdsourcing solutions. And so it does seem to me that despite the existing sort of limitations on access, that it's still worth thinking about the role of our own collective capital as a movement, as communities, as civil society. Okay, so kind of to the point that I wanted to get to, or sort of the inquiry that I'm really excited about, is to sort of start separating some of these things out. So, like on the community capital solutions, the reason that I wouldn't say that even like Kiva or some of these other crowdsource capital solutions are democratic, or again, if I have $50 million and you have $50, and I'm like, I want to invest $50,000 into this business, I just have a lot more influence over who gets capital. I mean, it's kind of obvious, right? But it's not like we have an equal say over this stuff. And so while there is value in having community capital solutions, I wonder, and I really appreciated your point, how do we actually separate the questions of ownership and access to profits with the questions on who controls the platforms and the businesses themselves? I think that's like a really essential piece. And so obviously preferred shares, for example, are a way in which that was done in worker co-ops. You want outside equity investors. You don't want them having control over your business, so you create this other kind of capital product that takes in patient equity but doesn't give them voting rights. But I think there's like a deeper complexity that needs to be built, especially in the platform cooperative space, because we're so interested in the multi-stakeholder solutions, right? Which means like we need a tranche for the founders, for maybe outside capital holders, as well as the users, as well as the labor, for sure, the workers themselves. And so like there's a number of different stakeholders, and we need to think about the democratization of control and access amongst these stakeholders, but we also need to be able to access money that like wealthy people might have or investors might have. And we don't want that larger portion of the capital stack to be controlled by those people, right? We don't want those folks having control over the decisions that happen in our companies. And so for me, sort of this question on how do you separate ownership from control and governance, and then also raising this question about the production, the decentralization of production in itself, I think is really exciting. And that's also where I've been really drawn to the blockchain space. So I'm really gonna quickly just touch on these, and then hopefully we have some time for conversation. So, obviously, again, as I was saying, the ownership piece, and I think there's lots of creative ways of thinking about how to get money in from lots of different people. In general, just co-ops, again, have struggled getting access to capital, so we need more creative impact investing solutions. But you could go to like impact investing conferences to learn about all this stuff, program-related investments, these kinds of strategies. To me, though, like the control and governance is a really interesting question. So let's say that the money piece isn't tied to your control over the products. Like there's this big question for me around like, okay, like with Ujima, for example, we're gonna be trying to figure out what people's shopping preferences are, what their particular needs are. That data, for example, is gonna be very, very valuable, right? And there's a way in which we know that we don't want someone else taking people's data, extracting it, and making money off of it. But is there a way for us to actually empower the users, the people who are generating this valuable content or data themselves, to actually have decision-making power over what content they want to expose to businesses to get advertising revenue, as an example, right? So I have this question of like, if you had a community of users, could you flip it to say, hey, like we represent X amount of purchasing power. Here's the 50 businesses that want to advertise with us. Here's our social impact standards. Let's vote on actually which companies we're going to allow to to have our eyeballs, right? And those are the kinds of conversations that you really can't have if the power is resting in the hands of capital. And on the flip side, you really want the sort of broad-based participation of the users who are impacted by these platforms to make these kinds of decisions. That's just one very small kind of governance decision that I think is interesting. And then finally, on the production side, I guess I just want to point out that I think the blockchain space is really interesting because of the sort of decentralization of the production itself. I haven't necessarily heard that to be an inherent component of platform cooperative. So you could be like a centrally governed and controlled business, which is most of the forms that we have. But the blockchain space sort of spreads out, right, diffuses the central players who can sort of generally influence or control these platforms. And so I think there's something there. And so on a sort of conclusion note, I just wanted to shout out Steemit, which is sort of an interesting cryptocurrency platform that I've really have been inspired by. Like, I'm a member of it. I don't use it that much. I don't think it's actually a great like user experience per se, but like the logic behind it is really interesting to me. So Steemit is a social media platform that's a blockchain-based application, runs on Ethereum. And unlike Facebook, right, it's owned by the users themselves. And so I think a couple things that are pretty cool, like Steemit, first of all, rewards people for producing content. So if I create a post and it gets a bunch of upvotes, right, I actually get Steam points and tokens, and these points, some of it could actually be converted into real money, so I could like cash that out into dollars and get paid through it. But also it sort of builds like a long-term equity kind of like position in the platform. And also I think what's most important is it actually gives you higher level of influence within the platform. So what that means then is if I create a great post, a bunch of people like my post, I have more Steam points, then someone else creates a post and I like it, my upvote has a larger impact on the conference of Steam points to that person, right? And so what's happening is that there's sort of a decentralization of the verification or sort of like recognition of added value in the community. And so like all of us say, Camille is dope, badass, I want to hear more about her, we all like her stuff, right? That actually gives Camille more power than to say, okay, well, let me tap these 4 other people who might also be worth listening to, right? And so there's a way in which like the crowdsourcing of value in a platform and the decentralization of ownership and recognizing the value that you add through actual financial position in a business, I think is also kind of unique. And so there's this interesting thing with Steemit where like you could just buy Steam points, right? But you could also earn value and actually get monetary benefit by contributing to this ecosystem. And I think that sort of like broad-based framework, and this is my first time ever talking about this publicly, so forgive me for being like kind of verbose and a little complex, but like to me, this is like the opportunity for how we kind of take that next level and thinking about big data, the implications of AI, like how do we actually take all the technologies and really ground them to reflect the needs, the values, and the goals that all of us as a community of social justice activists hold. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Aaron. So, process-wise, I was thinking that I would ask the audience for 3-4 questions, and we'll put them up here, and then see from the panel which ones really speak to them, because that's where they're going to give you the best content, is the ones that speak to them. So, do you want to just raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll try to make sure I get it up there right? Yep. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. So I'm coming from Europe, from school. So I have a question to be addressed to all panelists. Do you have any expectation from an international point of view? Do you, for instance, expect changing experiences in order to replicate your projects, your models, or do you is it possible for you to invest abroad? Does your relation allow you to invest in other countries? Or do you expect better regulation for this kind of new investment and finance you want to promote? Or any suggestions?
Great. Okay. Yep.
Coming from a completely being new to entrepreneurship or to co-ops, what stage do you typically work with an entrepreneur? What stage do you have to bring up?
Uh-huh. Oh, okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
someone had mentioned convertible bond implementing. Wondering if there was more experience with notes, bonds, and those types of investments up front. And the bubble, I mentioned the ballooning at the very end.
All right, I'm gonna put up two more after this one. Yep. Oh, okay. One and go ahead.
Since we are talking about impact, how do you measure the socio-economic impact of the projects apart from the traditional business model?
And in the back, I know there were two of you. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
After a crowdfunding campaign, how can a startup that is a worker co-op access funding? What would you recommend after a crowdfunding?
Okay. And I have one in my hand too. You talk about bite size and progression of capital. Right. I don't know what those words mean, so all right, so panelists, we can be formal, and I can give you dots, or you guys can just think and
I would do the bite size one.
bite size. Yeah.
Social impact.
Social impact. What's that?
I'm happy to speak to that one too.
Okay.
I could talk about corporate.
This notes up on the
And I
Okay.
can talk about that one too.
Okay, so let's do those three. So notes, bonds, measuring social impact, and bite size. Let's start with measuring social impact. So I think everybody can speak to that question.
This is obviously a difficult subject, and we grapple with it a lot at Van City. In terms of this, I'm going to answer that question specifically around this new fund that I mentioned earlier and that we're trying to put together, because we want to we're building in a social assessment into the request for loans into that fund. And I've been asked to sort of come up with some parameters around that. So it's a bit of homework. But then I thought, okay, maybe there's a more simple and direct way of doing it, especially if we're looking at co-ops. And that is to assess the co-op. We would assess the co-op based on two things. I mean, one, the strength of the business plan, obviously, because if there's no margin, there's no mission, right? But then also to assess the co-op against the 7 cooperative principles. Because if there's no principles, there's nothing, really. And so, I mean, what does that mean? In terms of principles 1 and 2, what is the health of the democracy of the co-op and its democratic governance? What is the membership's economic participation? Are we being asked to fund into a cooperative whose members are not willing to commit their own capital? Or if they are willing to commit their own capital, is that capital sufficient to the business that's required? Personally, I think if you're going to participate in a co-op, it should hurt a little bit in terms of that, right? If it's too easy, you're not raising enough capital. Is it autonomous? Is it working for the interests of the membership as opposed to other outside parties? Maybe there aren't, maybe there are other external investors involved, and maybe they have a little too much influence, too much involved in the co-op. What is the ultimate purpose of the co-op in terms of Principle 5? Is it working for the betterment of the membership? Is it working for the personal development of the membership as individuals, as human beings? Are they working with other co-ops? Or are they just trying to do this alone? I mean, I find that co-ops I see groups of people that get together and form a co-op, and then, and they do it in isolation from others. And they're weaker, right? They're slower to get off the ground, and then when they run into trouble, they have nobody to lean on. And ultimately, if they're achieving 1 to 6, then we would expect 7 would be in play, right? Or maybe not.
Concern for community.
Well, yeah, certainly.
Memorize the
Yeah, and I have to say, that we don't talk about, I don't think we talk about these things enough. And we've heard the word trust come up at the conference so far quite a lot over the last day and a little bit. We haven't talked a lot about reciprocity. We haven't talked a lot about social capital. And I think these are things that we really do need to build into these equations. And I think that's what that kind of social assessment is all about. And in terms of concern for community, there is an assessment for that. I mean, is the co-op mutualistic or is it social? Are they working for their own interests? And so when those interests are concluded, they're going to wrap up, they're going to demutualize the co-op and wrap it up? Or is this going to be a multi-generational asset? Is this going to serve the community beyond serving the immediate needs of its current membership? If it's the former, that's okay. I'd prefer to see the latter. Now, that's a lot to ask for somebody, but to do this. But we're gonna take that for a spin and see what happens.
Yeah, can you hear me? Cool. Yeah, really loved this idea of the mesh. All right. Yeah, I really love this idea that you brought up about measuring against the cooperative principles. That makes a lot of sense. So the question of how do you measure impact for us, I would say that we don't try to ascribe an impact metric or set of metrics. We're more interested in the company's self-reported impact metrics. So we often encourage companies as a part of our sort of co-design investment process to get tighter about their impact strategy, their theory of change. Really, how is this gonna create impact? Like, okay, sure, you're building this nice thing and you've got some revenue, that's great, but how does it lead to change? So that's one aspect is we work with the company to help them define their own impact metrics. I would say the core of how we think about it now, which is not final by any means, is we kind of think of the structure as being impactful in and of itself. A steward-owned company is, and especially a steward-owned cooperative is an impactful venture because it's by definition a multi-generational asset. Like you said, it's by definition going to create profit for society from doing impact work. I think this is a big open question in the social innovation and nonprofit scene that I'm really interested in, and I've done a bunch of work with NGOs and other sort of traditional organizations to think about how to measure impact. And I guess the downbeat is that there's no standard right now, and it wouldn't make sense to measure co-ops in the same way that you measure deploying mosquito nets in Africa. So we shouldn't try to compare apples to oranges. Yeah, I guess that's what I would say. A reference that is useful that you might be interested in is you can look up the multiple capitals framework for assessing impact. It's probably the framework that is the most developed that I've seen. So it asks you to sort of look at social impact in terms of the communities that you're affecting. It asks you to look at financial impact in terms of profits and donations. It asks you to look at environmental impact and a bunch of other, knowledge capital, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Repeat the title of that.
Multiple capitals. Yeah. Pretty straightforward.
And then you want to talk on
Did
impact?
you want to talk?
Yeah,
Did I?
absolutely. Please.
I think we look at a number of different things, and unfortunately, a lot of it's driven by who we're getting our money from. They don't have a vote, but they do drive some of the questions around how do we tell them that their money is making a difference, is what we give back to them. So, as a community development organization or CDFI, in that world, we're talking a lot about the jobs that are getting created. And then we try to go a step further and really look at to what degree are those living wage jobs, or to what degree are those jobs that with benefits and even with a say at the workplace. We're looking at affordable housing units created? So are there more, is our money that's going out actually making more housing units affordable, available to people? And then try to look deeper at what does that really mean for the community then, if there is more affordable housing, if there are better jobs. But once you're trying to get beyond those counts, it does get more costly and time consuming. And one of the real challenges is, as a small organization, our 5 staff people, who are really in the business of supporting cooperatives and getting the money out to the cooperatives, don't have a lot of time to try and figure out the academic models to really measure impact, right? So, I mean, we want to look at how the money that's put out really improves the financial condition of the members of the cooperative, of the community, how it may play out in terms of civic engagement. What does that mean if you have cooperative members who are now understand how to engage in democracy in different ways and have that practice? So those are all questions we would love to get a better handle at, and we have to find really simple proxies for that and try and measure those. So I think it's I'd say it's really imperfect, but something that is an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, I'll just say something real quick. I mean, I totally agree, appreciate with what was said, and I think B Corp. I mean, I do think there is a number of different kind of business impact standards and platforms and all that stuff out there. From the capital perspective side, we've been with the Boston Impact Initiative experimenting with social impact covenants, and so that's been like, okay, so right now, you're aspiring to pay a living wage, but you don't right now. So we're talking about like, okay, if you reach that threshold, we're going to drop your interest rate, or on the flip side, say you committed to increasing minority and women workforce, for example, and you're not reaching that, we're actually going to bump your interest rate after 3 years because you had a chance. So anyway, like I think kind of creating impacts tied to these things are exciting kind of future for us. I mean, even with Ujima, when I was saying earlier, like if you're a really good business, we were actually talking about 3 different layers of Ujima certification. There's sort of your good business, then your good business leader, and then the 3rd tier, we're calling it, not officially yet, but sort of calling it a social justice enterprise. And for us, actually, I would just want to throw out like, I'm about like not just triple bottom line businesses, but actually how does a private sector contribute to social movement building, right? And what I mean by that is people in the streets, resources for political advocacy, voting and civic engagement, right? And so there's this question for me about like, what role can the private sector and our good businesses in our communities actually contribute to social change, not just through their model of existence or through the product they provide, but actually in their contribution to political movement building. So that's my thought on that. Can I pick up on another one? Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna do the bite size real quick. So I think that's a really important question because
Can you reframe it?
oh yeah, so bite size questions. What I understand that to mean is like, okay, you need to raise $1 million, but no one's gonna give me $1 million just off the bat, but maybe they'll give me a small piece here, and sort of how do I like tie these pieces together? Is that okay? So the example I actually want to give is the Cerro Cooperative, which is the first co-op that we built out of the Workers Alliance that I was telling you earlier. It's a worker-owned green composting business owned mostly by people of color, working class folks in Boston. And it came out of 2 nonprofits, my organization and another group called Mascosh. And so this was like folks, none of us really had assets. The nonprofits were very small. But to this point, they've raised about $800,000 or $900,000 so far. So I just want to tell you the super quick story on how they got there. So you got like, okay, one benefit was they were part of a nonprofit organization, my group, and we actually raised initial $50,000 of grant dollars to actually pay for a manager, a business manager, as well as to pay for the co-op academy. And I think Stacy Cordero from Boston Center for Community Ownership is here. She was tweeting about this yesterday, I think. So she was the person who ran the co-op academy and did the training and the feasibility study with this group of about 5 workers at that time. And so that was obviously a really key piece of capital that I know not everyone has access to, but it was very important for us to sort of get that process started and get the training and capacity into the space. Okay, then they raised, then they came to us, actually, Boston Impact Initiative. I had just started working there, kind of, we got our fund off the ground, and they actually asked for $20,000, and they had no security, no revenue, no business operations, and so this was also a very high risk investment. But we partnered with another thing called Co-op Fund of New England, which is a well-known co-op lender, and we did sort of a zero security loan to them. They took that 20,000, that gave them a little bit more runway, and then they used some of that Let me make sure I'm getting this right. Yep. Use some of that then to pay for they used some of that to actually do an Indiegogo campaign, right? So some of it they went towards sort of like getting out their operations of the 20, but some of it then went to making a video that then they used to create an Indiegogo campaign, which they raised $17,000. They raised $17,000, took some of that to pay for a lawyer to do a direct public offering, which was kind of expensive. It was like $15,000, but they hired Jenny Kassan from Cutting Edge Capital at the time. And a direct public offering allows you to, it's like IPO, but not public like that, typically in state, and in this case, it was preferred shares, and they were able to raise $340,000 through this DPO. So then they had this DPO, and part of it was they actually were coming to us earlier for larger amounts of loans, but the thing was like they didn't have operations, there was no equity in the business, and so they wanted like $325,000 from us and other impact investors, but that wasn't plausible at the time. But once they came back in with the preferred shares and the equity in the business from the community, then it made it much easier for us to make the loan. And just on that piece, we broke that into two parts. We did a working capital loan and we did a equipment loan. So the equipment loan was collateralized through more traditional sources. We had 4 different funding sources. 2 of them put money in from 2 different sources. So this is a little bit in the weeds, but basically one was a foundation, and they used their foundation assets to invest in the equipment loan, but then they used their own personal family assets to invest in the working capital loan because it was much higher risk, right? And so that's where they are now, and they're actually doing one more round of fundraising, which is sort of in process right now. They have, I think, another like 200,000 coming in, hopefully soon. 100 of that might be equity. So anyway, that's an example of a bite-sized stringing together of a capitalization strategy, which honestly was kind of it was amazing, but it's also kind of bullshit, right? Like that you have to do all that, like because you're not wealthy, because you don't own a home, you can't get a traditional loan. And so I want to sort of encourage us to explore the creative side and also stand up more in the investment space to say that we can't have entrepreneurs jumping through a billion hoops, right? And I don't think it would have been possible for them to do this if there wasn't a bunch of us on the capital side that were really trying to like move and shift hoops around so that it was at least less crazy or somewhat plausible.
Yeah, no, that's a phenomenal example. Labyrinth is giving me a headache just thinking about somebody having to do all that. I mean, I think our preference also is to get 100% financing, even if it's on a microloan basis, right? And so an example I can give, and this is a very gave them a little bit of money. We're not a granting organization, but we do grants. I mean, we don't like to lead with this, but sometimes a surgical injection of a little bit of capital sometimes can go a really long way. And so we gave them a grant to do some of the community engagement around that, which fed into, and it's a similar story, you know, the chain of events, right? Fed into a presentation to the city of Vancouver that said, yeah, we like this. This will support the resilience of the community because now we have gear in community that can be used in case of emergency, right? So the city got behind it with permitting and also with some resources and money. Okay, that's good enough for us. So we came through with, we went to my colleagues and did a bit of a sponsorship around this piece. So now he's got a little bit of money to do the next, to gather everybody up and start organizing the co-ops themselves. We financed in terms of a microfinance loan that we're rolling out as these, because they're all on different time scales. So as the first container comes out, he gets the first amount of cash. Great. He went to our community foundation to try and get a grant. I actually discouraged that because now it's like, okay, there's like we keep coming back to the well, and that's not a great idea. Find some more partners. Went to the Vancouver Foundation and got a phenomenal amount of money, $75,000 from them, which is actually going to, based on the fact that the city of Vancouver and Van City were already on board, right? So these kinds of, partnerships lever other kinds of partnerships, right? And it becomes this kind of virtuous circle.
Perfect. So,
Can I speak to it, or
yeah.
move on?
So we're out of time. I'm gonna let Derek do speak to
that's
this
okay.
quick, and then do you all have 10 minutes to stick around so people can come up afterwards?
yeah.
Okay. So
Okay.
have a last word, Derek.
Sorry to hold you all. I just wanted to speak a little bit from a slightly different perspective, because I guess in the sort of spectrum of what we're talking about here, we're sort of more on, we would be closer to the VCs in this case, like investing semi-early risk capital. So I guess I just wanted to, because I know there's a lot of entrepreneurs in the room, I also want to just name some stuff that you can do to make this process easier for yourself. Because even with early stage, highly extractive companies that are fundraising traditionally on a business model that is known to work, they have to go through a series of gates with angels and other investors. So this is the case for everyone to some degree. The difference is that in this sort of venture capital space, especially, which has a ton of problems, especially when it comes to bias along racial and gender lines. Let's make that super clear. There is a sort of attitude of we want to get money deployed quickly. And I really, personally, what I want to see in the co-op capital space is I want to see that attitude. I want to see, let's deploy money really fast. Let's deploy it to companies that have a really good shot, and we know they have a good shot because they've shown some kind of indicators. So for us, we kind of only, this isn't totally true, but for the most part, we focus on post-revenue businesses, and it's especially great if you're making profit, that's amazing. But if you're post-revenue and you can see the end of the corridor to financial sustainability, it puts you in a really, really great position. And if you can't do that, if you can just show different kinds of validation, it's going to put you in just such a much better place to leverage other partnerships. So things like pre-committed sales, going out to your community or going out to your customers and saying, listen, we're going to sell this thing. Will you buy it? Can you just like sign this document I wrote on Google Docs that says that you'll buy it? Like, I'm being serious. This is, as an investor, this is something you look at and you say, okay, this person has tried really hard to validate their idea, and it's a strong signal. So I highly encourage to do that. And from our perspective as a sort of pseudo VC fund, we're also trying to organize a network of impact investors. So I'm super excited to take up the conversation with you all, and every time we invest in a company, often they bring a couple impact investors with them. We kind of help set the terms in a cooperatively friendly way, and then we can kind of invite those impact investors to say, hey, are you open to seeing more deals like this? Because we've got this deal flow and we want to deploy capital really fast, and we want to deploy it on cooperative terms. So yeah, I guess it's a mutual responsibility between the entrepreneurs. Like, you need to build very viable businesses with a lot of indicators that they can do well. And for us, we need to be able to connect you to the right people. And obviously I'm glossing over a lot of very subtle social issues that are in the space, but that would be some kind of quick advice.
All right, let's give these panelists a round of applause. Thank you so much. It looks like right now we have